Chapter 801, we're now adding to layout from the scrapbook. Okay, so what we've got is our blank template and we're on the cover page. We'll be going over to the details page or the plans and sections page in a bit. But for now, we need to set up our scrapbook link, because if we open up our scrapbook, then we expand down. I've still got this one from previous series, SketchUp for Architecture. Okay, but there's nothing in there relating to the current project. If we go to Preferences, so if you're using the Mac, you click on Layout and go down to Preferences. If we're using Windows, then Edit and down to Preferences. And then we click on the folders and we'll see under our scrapbooks, we can add extra links. Now these are the current links that are set up by default. And you could easily copy and paste the stuff that you want to use in your scrapbooks into these file paths, but it's so much easier to link to something that people could share on a network, or you know exactly where they are, because some of these are very difficult to access, especially on a Mac. So click the plus sign and then we'll browse for our Chapter 8 folder in the exercise files, and we'll go to the scrapbook folder and then we can load that in. So here I am in the exercise files. I've got scrapbook pages. That's the one I click. Let's say OK. That loads us up and then we can close this. And what we'll find then is that if we hit our drop down, then at the very bottom of the pile, because it's a new path, all of these exist in the layout default paths. We can click on sort of this drop down. It'll open up eventually because it's quite a big-ish file. And here we go. So we've got solid wall details, we have got window wall details, and we have got plan and section layouts. Now these plan and section layouts are from the original building that we modeled in the first part of this series. I've then taken the CAD files and I've added content and inserted some materials, so we haven't got to do that. It's a fairly laborious process. There's absolutely no need for me to show you how to do that. It's just adding fills and lines like we know how to do. So I've done that for you. So what we're going to do now is just grab the plan layout, and then on our plans and sections we can just click and drag this in. Okay, so it's so easy to do. All we have to do to generate scrapbook content is File, Save as Scrapbook. Okay, so then this would save this file as scrapbook content, and that would include things like the title block. So it's important, if you want to set the scale and you want to bring everything in together, is to turn it into a group. Otherwise it'll come in parts. That's the key thing with this scrapbook. It's very easy to use, and once you've got the hang of it, it's an absolute delight. So all your construction details, all the standard stuff that you have, that could all be saved in the scrapbook. Any notes, any text, any disclaimers, anything that you use on a regular basis. Just think of it as a block in AutoCAD or an XREF or something like that. Template files, all of these things can be stored. So it's a very, very useful thing. A couple more we'll bring in. So if we could go down to the section. Okay, so this one here, let's grab that and drop that in. And then let's grab this one and drop this in as well. It just fills in that top section of the page. The A2 size is very handy for this. We've got 1 to 100 scale here, and we've got 1 to 100 scale on this, and 1 to 100 scale on that. So what we'll do next is just sort of line these up a little bit. And what I'm going to do before I come back to the next exercise is just double click on these and just sort this bottom bit out, so I can just drag these lines out to the edge to take it from side to side, make it look a little bit more like we thought about it. And I'll do a similar thing with the line on top of that. So the other thing that's useful to know is you can adjust stuff that you bring in from the scrapbook as well. It's just content, and if it's an image, then you can't do much but edit the image. But if it is vector stuff, then we can just double click and get into editing it. Okay, so see you in the next exercise, and we will look at referencing details from these views. Chapter 802, referencing details from views. What we've got now, I've set this up so it looks a bit neater. So I've put a little bit of notation on here as well. I've said section BB, section AA. What do these mean? Well, these are referencing these cut lines along here, just like you do in SketchUp with your model and the slice option, the section slice. Then this indicates where that section slice has been taken. So I've got 3 section slices on this drawing. Only 2 of them are on this sheet. The third one sits in here, that's section CC. But this one, section AA, I think this is, or BB, this one. Let's zoom in a bit. So section BB is cut through here, and it's looking in this direction. This pointed bit here means that the direction of travel for this view is this one. And section AA is looking back that way. And what then we do is with the section A and section BB is show those here. So someone looking at this drawing will be able to look at this section BB and then understand that it's coming cut through here and looking in this direction. Okay, that's the important bit. If we were looking in this direction, then we wouldn't be seeing this part of the building. We'd be seeing this bit of the building, but in a different orientation. Okay, so it's sometimes a little bit tricky to get your head around which bit's facing which. And I often see from some of the students, they put the section line in and it's pointing in a direction that doesn't actually match what we're looking at. Okay, so they've got the orientation of this thing wrong. Maybe this thing needs to be flipped, or this thing needs to be set differently. So it's kind of important that you get the direction of travel right with these things. Now, what we're going to do with our details is we're going to show details of sort of this area and this area and this bit, and also sort of this and the intersection between the timber clad and the render, and then maybe another version of the threshold, because this threshold has got the door opening in it and this one doesn't. So what we could do is just put little sort of circles on each of these bits and then say detail 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. However, what tends to happen is it gets a bit messy, and when you're trying to read these drawings, maybe this is printed out or reduced on a photocopier or something, then you might find that it's not very clear. So always a much better way is to highlight the whole thing. So this is detail 1 and detail 2, and then on another drawing have this then set at a scale of maybe 1 to 50 or 1 to 20 or the imperial equivalent, and then on that one highlight the areas where you're going to take the details from. So you're basically scaling up to levels of detail that makes life a lot easier for people to understand. So then you haven't got to try to work out whether this is the correct detail. It might be sitting over something, the text might be not very visible. So all the sorts of reasons why you might just want to highlight a certain area and then show that with a lot more detail. So we're going to do that for this bit and for this bit. And we'll use this rectangle tool. And if I come over to my shape style, this one here, then there's no fill with just a stroke. And the stroke will be dashed. So we'll use the dash and we'll probably up it to maybe 0.2 or something. I'm not sure whether the 0.5 is going to be fine, but we'll find out in a second. So it's the rounded rectangle. Okay, the rounded rectangle. We want not just the rectangle, so it looks a bit neater. And then we come around and create that sort of highlight. Now, if your bubbles on the rectangle are looking a bit too round, then use the up or down arrows to adjust that level of sort of sharpness, as it were. So I'll leave it at about that. And then that'll be fine for this one. And then I'll come over and create another one around here. Okay, don't want to take this down so far. It's slightly lower than the other one as well. So just come over and stretch it out maybe a little bit. And what you want to do with this is make sure you encompass the whole area that's being inspected, okay, as it were. And then that should be fine. What we'll do next is just label this up with the label tool. I'll call this one detail 2. And I'll call this one detail 1. And then on our detail sheet, we can start adding more content from our scrapbook. Chapter 803, setting an appropriate scale. It's worthwhile pointing out about scale and detail and the amount of information you show. It's often a thing that confuses people. People can often get caught between scales or use inappropriate scales. So I just thought it would be worthwhile just running over some of these key bits of information that you need to be aware of. And again, like all detailing, one size definitely does not fit all. So it's down to judgment calls that you make. Experience will help. And so let's get going and see what I mean. So we've created our callouts. So this is set at 1 to 100. So the amount of detail on this is completely appropriate. We can see basically what's going on inside. We can see the shape of the roof and the sections. So everything is fine. 1 to 100, absolutely perfect for this sort of thing. However, we need to explain what goes on this wall and on this wall. How does the window and the door work? How do all the finishes work? And we know that we've built it from a 3D model, so we have all that information. So going over to the details page, I've got nothing on here at the moment. I'm just going to zoom out, and then I'm going to drop down to my scrapbook, okay, and I'm going to drag this scrapbook element out, and I'm also going to go to the window wall details and drag this one out. So we should have two details that, to all intents and purposes, have sort of the same look to them. I've tried my best to make sure that all these sort of hatches are matching, but we have the difference in so much as this is showing how the wall works when you've got the timber cladding at the bottom and the render at the top, and how this one works where you've got the door at the bottom and the window at the top. What I've also noticed is when you bring in some of these scrapbook elements, it does reorder the way in which some of these things work. It's an easy fix. You just have to go in to the various materials. So I've lost the hatch look on this. It is there, it's just underneath. So if I select this object, right click, arrange and send to back, then it appears. So I'll do that for these to make sure this all looks neat and tidy for the sort of final version. But we've got to ask ourselves whether this scale 1 to 50 is going to be suitable for this. Now, to be honest, it's probably over detailed for 1 to 50, okay? But with modern printers, you do get quite good clarity of line, so you could probably get away with this. The other option is to take this up to maybe 1 to 20, or if you're looking at imperial scales, 1 to 16 or 1 to 24. That's half or 3/4 of an inch, equaling a foot. Okay, so I'll just do that, right click, and then go down to scale, and I'll set mine at 1 to 20. And you can see it's much, much bigger. Okay, but my details that I'm going to use to call out this information are going to be 1 to 10. That should give me enough information to show all of the interesting and the intricate little flashings that we have and the trim elements that we have. Okay, so if I'm going to fill up an entire page with this whole section, which I don't need to do, then it's probably going to be slightly inappropriate. We might decide on something that's less detailed, that 1 to 20 would be fine. But we don't need to show all of this wall. We just need to show this top bit, this intersection, and this bottom bit. So I think, for the purposes of this next task, that 1 to 50 will be fine. And then we're going to highlight these key areas on the various 1 to 50s, and then bring in the details below. Okay, so what I'm going to do between now and the next exercise is to get all of my fills sorted out. And if you want to do this yourself, then feel free to work on this drawing. And then move this one slightly over here and change the scale back of this one to 1 to 50. And position this somewhere appropriate so they line through. I'm also going to just add a little sort of base to both of these to separate these two out. And then I'll be bringing in the relevant sort of details 1, 2, and 3, line those up to make sure that they sort of work on top of each other, and put little highlights on these to say what detail 1, 2, and 3 is. So then we can look at, in the next exercise, how to use the annotation tools to add some neat annotation to this drawing. Chapter 804, adding annotation. Now, this really isn't a lesson on how to use this thing, label. It's really about how you shouldn't sort of annotate badly on a drawing. This drawing is all about providing information, whether it's the heights, the thicknesses, or the materials, or the way in which one thing sits on top of another. These drawings will also be working alongside a specification, which will specify the manufacturer's materials and the recommended manufacturer's fitting instructions. Just in case you have a problem with something, if you can prove that you fitted it exactly as the manufacturer had outlined, then you might be able to get some recompense. If you haven't fitted it exactly as the manufacturer has recommended, then there's probably little chance of getting anything back from them. They'll just put it down to shoddy workmanship or bad detailing. Okay, so let's have a look at some of this stuff. So we've got a lot of information here, and we can probably tell from some of these things what they are. This is insulation. This is a roll of insulation. Covering this gap, we've got some 6x4 timbers, but we don't know they're 6x4 timbers. We've got some other bits and pieces. This is a window. We don't know what type of window, and this, in fact, is a door. Okay, so whilst we can tell what certain things are, we can't say exactly what these things are, or we don't know what the thickness is. So what I often see is people, first of all, putting random dimensions on things. So say the dimension tool is here, and they will start dimensioning maybe one of these things and just telling me how big that is. Now, I know it's not set to the correct scale. I'm just trying to prove a point here, even to go across the opening. Or they might think, I think, well, this is a really important dimension between those two battens there. So before you know it, your drawing is covered with information that is completely and utterly not required. Okay, so avoid dimensions on details if you can at all help it. There are certainly instances where dimensions are useful, machine parts, etc., all those sorts of things. But when you're talking about sort of how to put things together and you're describing something as a 6x4 timber, you don't need to put the dimension on there as well. You could, in fact, just describe the whole makeup of the wall. So starting from the cladding on the outside and working through to the skim coat on the inside. So that could again just be a note that explains the wall construction, typical wall construction. Okay, so that's the sort of thing you could add as well. When you are going to use labels, and you can preset your label information, I tend to use a thin stroke for this. This arrow is fine. My annotation size, 12-point font, anything between 10 and 12 would be fine. When you start to annotate, then you can either go off at an angle or come square. Probably what's useful is to not do these sorts of things. Get it very, very messy. Okay, now you might think, well, I would never do that, but I see this all the time. People have just decided there's a space over there that needs a bit of information, or there's a space up here that I can put something. And so before you know it, then the drawing is starting to look like a complete and utter mess. Okay, so bear that in mind. No unnecessary dimensions, and try to think as carefully as possible where you put your annotation. I do appreciate that sometimes you can't put it where it would be obvious, but that doesn't mean to say you can't think a little bit carefully about maybe moving some other stuff to a place where that might be better suited. But as soon as you start crossing this information over, and maybe it crosses at this point, I don't know whether this is coming there or this is coming down here. So as it's all about clarity, you need to maintain that clarity from the start to the finish. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an insight to the things that get me frustrated when I'm looking at work that is hard to interpret. Now, I'll provide a version that I think is reasonable, and then you can use that as a basis for future. But you might find that you're working for a practice, or you're a new starter to a practice. They might have their own conventions anyway. So as far as you're concerned, everything should be relatively easy. But even if you've been given the font height and the arrow and all those sorts of things, just be careful about where you position your arrows. Okay, it is important. Okay, so that's the end of this short chapter. What we're going to look at next is a little bit of material and the application of materials to our 3D models. We're going back to our SketchUp file. We shall make that look a little bit more realistic. And then if you've got access to V-Ray, or you can maybe download a free trial, then have a go at rendering it and hopefully making it look like something we see in one of those posh construction brochures.